Did John the Baptist have a crisis of faith while in prison? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Luke on Walking Through the Bible. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Luke chapter 7. We're going to be reading from verses 18 to 23. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Luke chapter 7, beginning at verse 18. Then the disciples of John reported to him concerning all these things. And John, calling two of his disciples to him, sent them to Jesus, saying, Are you the coming one, or do we look for another? When the men had come to him, they said, John the Baptist has sent us to you, saying, Are you the coming one, or do we look for another? And that very hour he cured many of infirmities, afflictions, and evil spirits, and to many blind he gave sight. Jesus answered and said to them, Go and tell John the things you have seen and heard, that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who is not offended because of me. In our last lesson, we studied about how Jesus raised the son of the widow at Nain. We noted that Jesus didn't raise the dead often, but he did here because he had compassion on this widow, for this was her only son, so without him, she would likely have been destitute. In raising this man from the dead, though, it caused the people to recognize that God had visited his people. This visitation was what Zacharias spoke of in chapter 1. Coming now to verse 18, we don't get a time marker as to when this story takes place. In our study of Matthew, this story is placed right after Jesus sends his disciples out on the limited commission, but from our study of Mark and later on in Luke, we know that the limited commission would be later, thus placing this story at a different time period in the book of Matthew. It is thus safe to conclude that where Luke places this story is chronologically correct. What we need to remember from chapter 3 is that John the Baptist is in prison. He has not died yet, for we won't get that told to us until chapter 9. The story that Luke tells us here, though, is a peculiar one, and one that has left many people confused as to what is happening. John the Baptist sends his disciples to Jesus with a question, which was, Is Jesus the coming one, the Messiah, or should they look for another? The wording of the question is not confusing, for it's fairly straightforward, but it's the reason for the question that is confusing. That's because we know John the Baptist earlier in Luke as one who taught that there was one mightier than he who was coming. In the books of Matthew and John, John the Baptist even identified Jesus as the Messiah. Chronologically, John's question probably occurs 1 year to 18 months after Jesus' baptism, when he would have made that confession. There are really three possibilities for John's question. 1, he had a lack of faith or a wavering in his faith. 2, he was confused about Jesus' kingdom. Or 3, he had ulterior motives. John wanted his disciples to believe in Jesus. With that in mind, let's examine these three possibilities. Option 1, a wavering of faith. Being in prison can lead our mind into places it should not go. We aren't busy doing anything else, and our mind can wander and begin to doubt things that we were sure of before. Jesus had not come to visit John in prison. He may have felt abandoned. So perhaps John needed some reassurance that Jesus was the Christ. While it is certainly possible for someone's faith to waver, I believe this one is the least likely, mainly because of Jesus' response. He didn't go on to chastise John for his weak faith. Instead, he later praised him in this chapter. So while it is not impossible for John's faith to have wavered, I find this to be the least likely option. Option 2, confusion about Jesus' kingdom. The Jews were expecting an earthly kingdom when the Messiah came, and most likely John shared that belief. So when this didn't happen the way John expected, his question was asking if Jesus was the one who had come to remove the sins of the world, but another would come to set up an earthly kingdom. This option wouldn't have John denying who Jesus was, but seeking to clarify Jesus' mission. That Jesus didn't act in the way the Jews, or quite possibly even John, expected him to act, like a king, could have easily led John to question whether there was still another person to come. After all, Peter believed that Jesus was the Son of God in Matthew 16:13-18, yet still was confused about the kingdom even after Jesus' resurrection, as we see in Acts 1 verse 6. Knowing that this option wouldn't require one to deny who Jesus was, but simply be confused about why Jesus wasn't declaring himself to be a king the way they expected, is why we can't immediately discount this as a possibility. Moving on to option 3 now, we have an ulterior motive. In this scenario, John wasn't asking the question for himself, but for the sake of his disciples. This sometimes is something we do because people won't believe us. We say, "Don't believe me? Go ask them." This would mean that John did have full knowledge about Jesus, but his disciples didn't. So for their sake, he asked them to ask the question. In John 3:25-30, John will say of himself, "He," meaning Jesus, "must increase, but I must decrease." I find it quite possible that John's disciples were distressed that John had been in jail, yet still not convinced that Jesus was the Messiah, so John sent them to Jesus to find out. So having examined the 3 options, which one is it? The fact of the matter is, we're not entirely sure. While it is quite possible that John had a moment of weakness in faith, I still find that the least likely possibility. Out of possibilities 2 and 3, I find 3 the most likely because John wanted his disciples to follow Jesus. However, if we're being honest, we have to admit, though, that we don't know for sure. And that's okay, for since the scriptures don't reveal it to us, we don't need to know. What we do need to know is that Jesus declared he was the Messiah and that all signs he performed attested to that being true. That's what Jesus told John's disciples to tell John. For blessed is the man who does not stumble over or be offended by who Jesus was and what he was teaching. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Luke chapter 7, verses 24-35, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.